From SBI's Executive Briefing Center in Dallas, Texas, the most watched and listened to content in B2B sales and marketing, it's the SBI Podcast with your host, Matt Shares.
Welcome to SBI TV, a weekly show dedicated to helping you make your number. Today we're going to discuss the role that customer insights and stories play in B2B selling. I'm your host, Matt Shares. I'm the CEO of SBI. Joining me in the studio today is Jim O'Gara, and Jim is the CEO of StoryDimensions. And Jim's firm is a sales enablement technology company that captures, develops, and delivers real customer insights and stories, and they do it at scale. That's the key thing. So stories that B2B sales professionals can use to establish credibility, earn trust, and ultimately close more business. So first off, Jim, welcome to the show.
Thanks
welcome to the studio. Yeah, great to see you. So for those that don't know, maybe if you could introduce yourself, introduce your firm, that would be great.
Yeah, happy to. I'm Jim O'Gara. I'm the CEO at StoryDimensions. And StoryDimensions, as you mentioned, is a SaaS sales enablement company. And really what we're focused on is closing a gap that's been basically growing in the B2B world between buyers and sellers, okay? And so what is that gap? Well, the reality is the buyer conversations are shifting. And buyers today really want to know what their peers are doing. Or in other words, what a sales rep's customers are doing. The decisions they're making, the experiences and journeys that they're undertaking, and ultimately the challenges and the successes that they're achieving. So the reality, though, is most B2B salespeople aren't armed with the ammunition, if you will, that they need to have that level of conversation with a buyer. And so what we've done is we're kind of on a mission to close that gap and enable salespeople to rapidly access the insights and stories about their real customers so they can create those meaningful connections with buyers and ultimately close more deals.
All right, very good. So if you're watching or listening out there and you want to make sure you catch all of the SBI shows, if you want to access our content library, if you're an iPhone user, you can just download the SBI app, go to the Apple Store, search for Sales Benchmark Index, and then you can use your iPhone, get the notifications to bring you this content, whether you're traveling, doing a workout, or on your commute. So let's jump into the questions. And in this segment, Jim and I are going to talk a little bit about the role that stories play in the sales process and how specifically they influence buying decisions. So, Jim, all kinds of work written and content written on managing the buying process and managing that whole end-to-end cycle. So I guess let's start at 10,000 feet. Talk to us a little bit about, from your vantage point, the role that stories play as it relates to influencing buying decisions.
Sure. I mean, there's a ton of research out there about the fact that stories do actually make a difference in the buying process. And I'll point to a couple statistics for the audience. So Influitive did some research, and what they found was upwards of 90% of B2B buying decisions are influenced to one degree or another based on what peers say or think about a vendor or a solution, right? Makes sense. Another statistic that's interesting is when Forrester asked executive B2B buyers what they value most from sales conversations and what helps them make better purchasing decisions, 71% said real customer examples and stories. So there's a ton of statistics out there that support this fact. But I think the bigger question is why? Why do stories matter? And, specifically customer stories. And the reality is they matter because, believe it or not, B2B buyers are humans. They actually think and behave just like all of us, which means we use both rational and logical thought as well as emotion in our decision-making process.
So if I'm watching the show and most of our viewers are CEOs, heads of sales, heads of marketing, upper leaders in organizations and heads of sales ops and enablement. So the next question I'm asking is, hey, Jim, do the stories actually allow and cause reps to sell more? So is there evidence, and why, other than the basic of rational and emotional, which I totally get and everybody would understand, have you seen that have an impact? And maybe can you share a story of where you've seen it work and how you've seen it work?
Absolutely. Well, I think that I'll go back to evidence, right? You asked the question, is there evidence that they make a difference? Well, I think, we all probably know Mike Bosworth. He the founder of Solution Selling many years ago. He did some research and he wanted to understand what high performers were doing that others were not, right? And the research, showed that 20% of your reps are generating upwards of 80% of your revenue. I think you guys put out some numbers similar to that. I think it was 13% are generating 87% of your revenue. But the question is then, what are those top 20% doing differently? And Mike did some additional discovery, and what he found was that they are connecting emotionally with their buyers. Yep. They're establishing a degree of trust before they get into why their product or service or solution may be better. So, and many of those are using stories to do that. Yeah. And so there is evidence that it does move the needle, and that those that perform better achieve a higher percentage of their quota quarter over quarter. Yep. Use stories.
So, last question in this segment. Most people would say, well, if I have case studies and I use a case study and I just tell it, that's a story. True or false?
False.
Okay.
Okay. And I think that's probably one of the biggest misnomers out there, is that a case study is equivalent to a story. So let's talk about what a story is, right? A story is about people. Okay, and most case studies, if you look at them, they're really company to company. Okay, they're entity to entity stories, if you will, and that's a stretch.
Great point.
So, this is what Microsoft did for 7-Eleven, okay? Yep. But when you're selling, you're dealing with a human, okay? And you want to connect with them on a personal level. And so stories bring that human element to life. So that's one way. The other way is that stories are short and engaging, okay? Most case studies are 3-4 pages long, okay? They're written in corporate communications, Marcom kind of speak, right? Sure. Stories are personal. They humanize conversations. So that's another way that they're different. And then I would say the third way that stories are different, they're about somebody else, okay? Again, case studies are mostly about what the company did and the product and how it solved a problem. Mm-hmm. But stories are about someone else and their journey and their experience. So a customer story puts the customer at the center. And case studies still today, the majority, focus too much on the company. Very good.
All right, so in this segment, Jim and I are going to focus on the need to provide sellers with insights so that when they're developing these stories, they connect with buyers in meaningful ways. So more specifically, think about this as stories that inspire interest, engagement, and commitment. So, Jim, based on that, when you think about the insights that a customer story needs to have to be effective in your mind and what you've seen, because you've been doing this for a while, what does that look like?
Well, I think define effective. And to me, effective means it's meaningful to your buyer, right? Yep. So for it to be meaningful, it has to be relevant. And so at StoryDimensions, we look at it from multiple dimensions, if you will, of relevancy. And the first three relevant factors of a story are what I'll call table stakes, okay? For you to make a connection with a buyer, your story has to pertain to them personally, their role, okay? So the story should come from one of their peers. That's first. The second is the type of business, okay? If you're meeting with a CEO at a $10 million business and you're sharing a story about American Airlines or another, Fortune 500 company, there's going to be a disconnect there. You're not making a meaningful connection with him because he can't relate. Yeah. The other is kind of table stakes. The last one is industry. A lot of business owners, leaders believe there are nuances and unique attributes to their industry. And so they want to know that whoever this story is about, they kind of live and breathe in the same world. Okay. So those are the first three. I guess the two that really matter the most is, are you sharing a story that connects with that buyer where they are today and more importantly, where they want to be or desire to be. And that's the reason you're having the conversation. They're not happy with status quo. They want to and aspire to do more. So you've got to connect with them on the challenge that they face, something similar, something relevant, and also their vision for success. So that'd be another one.
So what challenges do salespeople typically encounter when they're trying to activate stories?
Well, I think it comes down to what we see is three things: accessibility to the stories. The second is probably format. Making it easy for them to activate the stories. And then the third is back to relevance. You know, can I find a story that's even going to be relevant to the sales opportunity I'm pursuing? So accessibility is all about delivering customer insights and stories to your sellers in daily sales activities, serving it up to them in a way that they can easily activate. In most companies, case studies are housed out on a server somewhere or up on the website. They've got to dig through them, figure out which one might be applicable. They're not accessible. They're not readily accessible in sales activities. The second piece that I touched on was format. Right? And we talked a little bit about that, but you know, salespeople don't need a novel. They need a 30-second story for a phone conversation. They need a 2-minute story for the meeting they've got this afternoon. And the reality is, most companies aren't serving stories up to salespeople in those formats. And then we talked about the last one, which is can I find a story that's relevant to my specific sales opportunity?
Okay, very helpful. All right, so as Jim and I roll into our next segment, we're going to talk about this whole concept of equipping sellers with insights, and we're going to do it through the lens of leaders. So what are the sales leaders, the sales enablement folks, marketing teams, what must they do differently to equip the salespeople with the stories that are actually going to use and they're going to have a positive impact? So, Jim, where do you see companies, I guess, embracing this and doing it well, and where do you see them falling down and skinning their knee?
Well, the good news, you know, for us as a business, and I think for the sales discipline at large, is that storytelling is getting people's attention because there's been some research behind it as it relates to its impact on buying decisions and the sales process. I guess the bad news side of that is what's happening, what we're seeing a lot of is sales leaders sending their sales reps out to storytelling, training, and education classes. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think it's very important that we all aspire to be TED-worthy storytellers, right? But we can't get the cart before the horse. You know, just like an actor's no good without their lines, a great storyteller is no good without any source material. So they're forgetting the most important part. Are we serving up real insights and stories that our storytellers can use? The other piece I think is something we've seen folks stumble with is putting the onus for capturing and gathering and writing the stories on the sales reps. And while every sales rep's got their go-to 2 to 3 stories that they use, their job isn't to be script writers or story writers. They don't have the time, and that's not what you're paying them to do. So they've got to find a way to allocate some resources or partner to get those stories packaged and delivered on a consistent basis. Got it.
Okay. So then my last question, I guess, what are the metrics that an executive should use to tell me that it's working?
Right. A couple of things I would look at. The first is probably a soft metric. It's sales productivity. You know, there's research out there that say salespeople spend upwards of 40% of their time searching for or creating content in preparation for sales activities. Well, if you've put in place a process where you're serving up stories in line with daily sales activities, you're freeing them up to do what they do best, which is get in front of customers.
So selling time, what else?
The other two would be probably tied to sales efficiency and effectiveness. So specifically, how can we reduce the time to close. So companies that are tracking story utilization at different stages of the sales cycle and consistent use of those are able to assess whether or not they are in fact reducing the time to close. And then ultimately close rates, right? So are your reps that are utilizing stories effectively in sales situations closing at a higher rate than those that aren't? And that's going to differ from one company to the next, but putting those processes and measurements in place is critical.
Yep, got it. Well, Jim, I appreciate you coming by. I think what I learned is the reminder and the importance of how people learn and how they make decisions, right? Through emotion, but also the reminder that people love stories. They learn through stories.
Yes.
And they're charged and disrupted to make change, and ultimately that's what a salesperson's driving. They're driving a from and a to. So
absolutely.
On behalf of the SBI team and the audience, I appreciate you coming by.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it.
So as always, on behalf of the firm, I appreciate you, our audience, for tuning in. You've got a choice where you put the eyes and the ears, and the fact that you'd spend that time with us means a great deal to me. So that's it for today. As always, until next time, I wish you good luck as you try and make your number.
This has been the SBI Podcast. For more information on the studio, SBI's Executive Briefing Center, our team, or to schedule a workshop, please visit salesbenchmarkindex.com.